posted that, we should be good to go on the transcript being created. So great. Thank you all for joining this combined meeting of the
Colin,
sources.
before you start, I was going to point out the slides that you're sharing are for the infrastructure working group.
Oh, let's see. That is. Nope, just the first slide is for the
just the title.
group.
Okay.
I suppose that was. Thank you for the call out, Uwer.
No problem.
We'll move past that slide because that is in the wrong slide deck. But I believe that the rest of the slides that we'll see today are, yes, the correct one. So don't be concerned that you're getting a repeat of yesterday. So coming off of the recording starting, wanted to level set on meeting logistics. I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on these. They're similar to other working groups. Please mute your microphone unless you raise your hand, in which case we can reach out to you to comment directly. Feel free to use the chat box to ask questions directly. Note that this meeting is being recorded. And so before you speak or when you speak, please first state your name for the record. And now we'll quickly walk through what we'll be covering in this meeting. So first, some time for welcome and introductions, a bit of extra time because we have a number of people on this call. I know a number of people have been together on these meetings before, but we have some new faces and it's just been a little while, so we want to make sure everyone is refamiliarized with who is involved in this effort and who's here today. Then we'll do a quick review of the working group schedule, so people can see what's coming up and kind of where we are in the overall timeline. Next, I'd say the bulk of the meeting is dedicated to a review of the updated hydrogen end use evaluation that was sent out a little over a week ago, and updated evaluation sent out yesterday, with plenty of time for discussion on those evaluation conclusions. And then near the end, we'll do a quick introduction to some of the analysis that's been done on hydrogen prices and comparison to other fuels that it could be used to replace, before wrapping up with Q&A and next steps. Also won't go into this in much detail, just be aware that Strategen is coordinating these working group meetings in coordination with Connecticut Green Bank and the various co-chairs of the working groups. And so you'll be hearing a lot from me going through this process and other people from the Strategen team. All right, and now we'll go through introductions for the group. I'll start, and then I'll kind of read through the participants that I see in teams, just in the order that I see them, which appears to be alphabetical. When I call on you, please introduce yourself, provide your title and your organization that you're representing. Also, if you are a co-chair of either the sources or uses working group, please feel free to identify yourself as such. So starting myself first, my name is Colin Smith. I'm a senior consultant at Strategen, and I've been focused on developing different hydrogen ecosystem hub designs through a number of different projects through Strategen. And now very deep in the weeds on doing the same in Connecticut. Next up, Ahmet from LBN.
Hi, Ahmet Kusolu. I'm a scientist at Berkeley Lab in California.
Thanks, Ahmet. Andrea?
Hi, I'm Andrea Labawi, Senior Engineer of Hydrogen Affairs with Toyota. I sit in the Washington, D.C. office.
Excellent. Eric?
Hi, I'm Eric Gannis. I work at DEEP in the Office of Supply and on the hydrogen issues. Good to see everyone.
Paul Aresta.
Hi, I'm Paul Aresta. I'm with the Council on Environmental Quality.
Great. Ben Butterworth.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Butterworth with Acadia Center. I'm the Director of Climate, Energy, and Equity Analysis at Acadia Center.
Bernie.
Hi, I'm Bernie Pelletier with People's Action for Clean Energy. We've been working for a long time on energy efficiency, adoption of renewables, and electrification of almost everything. So eager to be here. Thank you.
Eliasid?
Hi everyone, this is Eliasid Animas. I'm a consultant with Strategy.
Aaron?
Good afternoon, everyone. Erin Childs, Director with Strategy, and very excited to be joining today.
Thanks, Aaron. Joel?
Joe Reinbold, CCAT.
Thanks, Joel. I'll also note that Joel is one of the co-chairs for the uses working group. Jordan?
Thanks, Colin. Jordan Ahern, Junior Analyst Intern here at Strategy.
Thanks, Jordan. Kathy?
Kathy Ayers, Vice President of R&D at Nel Hydrogen and co-chair for the Sources Working Group.
Kathy? Tony?
Hi, this is Tony Leo from Fuel Cell Energy. Had to find the unmute button. Great to see you all.
Thanks, Tony. Mary?
Hi there, Mary Louise Nuara. I go by Wheezy. I'm the State Policy Director for New England at Dominion Energy.
Excellent. Nathan?
Nathan Froling, Director of External Affairs for the Connecticut chapter of the Nietzsche Conservancy and also oversee our climate and energy program. Good to be here.
Good to have you. Uwer?
Good afternoon, Uwe Pascholler, Professor of Mechanical Engineering at UConn, most of the co-chair of the Sources Working Group.
Great. Callum?
Hi, Callum Preeb, just a member of the public listening in.
Great to have you. Samantha?
Hi, Sam Danowski, she, her. I'm the State Director of Sierra Club's Connecticut chapter.
Shannon?
Hey everyone, I'm Shannon Lawn. I'm an attorney and the Connecticut State Director for Conservation Law Foundation.
Thanks, Shannon. Finally, Trent?
Hi, I'm Trent Moulter. I'm President and CEO of Skyr. We do hydrogen generation, compression, and separation.
Excellent. Great to have you. I believe that's everyone I see in the meeting, but if I forgot to call anyone or missed anyone or anyone joined during the intros, feel free to introduce yourself now.
Hi all, this is Becca Treach, Senior Policy Advisor at Connecticut Deep.
Hi, Becca. Sorry for passing by you initially. Excellent. It looks like we got a great group of people here for this, hour and a half. So with no further ado, I'll move on to the next part of the agenda. Quick look at the meeting schedule for working groups. So we're in the October series of working groups. This working group, as I noted, is a combined working group between the sources and uses working groups. These working group meetings occur on a monthly cadence. The next one will be in November, where sources and uses will once again meet separately. And then in December, we'll have another joint meeting between the two working groups before results are presented to the Connecticut legislature in January. I'll also wanted to give everyone a chance to take a look at the schedule to identify when other working groups are meeting. If you're interested in attending any other working groups, these are the locations or not the location, the times that they would be occurring. Feel free to reach out to receive an invite to learn more. But moving on to the main part of the agenda, looking at the hydrogen end use evaluation framework that was developed and applied with the results sent out a little over a week ago to everyone. I wanted to, this will be the first time we're presenting these rankings as a group. And so I wanted to start by providing some additional context and a kind of description of the evaluation, reviewing some of the information we've already discussed and putting it and contextualizing it within the overall analysis, maybe more so than we've had time to in the past. And then finally, we'll have plenty of time to review and discuss the updated results from this analysis. So first, to put things in context, I wanted to talk a little bit about what this framework is designed to do and the limitations of kind of what it can do. So this framework was designed to provide a simplified way of comparing end uses for hydrogen across a series of criteria. It's kind of designed to develop an organized approach to assessing and comparing hydrogen use in different applications so that everyone can be kind of speaking the same language and approaching things from the same direction. It unfortunately cannot capture all the nuance involved in decision making within the energy system. That's very difficult to do with like an 8x12 chart. And so as Connecticut continues to incorporate hydrogen into its decarbonization strategy, there will be other factors that will likely be considered, which I'll go into a bit more detail later. But I wanted to kind of level set on that so we can move into a discussion of exactly what this framework, how it will be applied going forward in the analysis. So this framework will be used to directly inform the analysis we're conducting on potential demand for hydrogen within Connecticut. It'll do this by helping us develop different demand scenarios, like high, medium, and low demand scenarios for hydrogen using a tiered approach that will be, as I noted, directly informed by the framework. And I'll go into more detail on this on the next slide. In addition to that, the framework will indirectly inform recommendations in the final reports, but only as one factor to consider. Other factors that will be considered include the demand for hydrogen or fuel cells from a particular end use, which will be developed through that demand analysis. So it's possible that some end uses will be, have a very strong case for hydrogen applications, but aren't a particularly large energy user in the state of Connecticut. And so may not, the Connecticut legislature may not deem that to be a worthwhile focus of their efforts. In addition, there may be complementarities between different end uses that could be taken into account. For example, hydrogen HT use in trucking could help support the use of hydrogen in forklifts or in industrial campuses where those trucks travel to. These are different end uses that would score differently on the actual evaluation, but there may be opportunities as projects are actually developed to take advantage of different synergies between separate and distinct applications. Finally, the state will need to consider what policy levers it actually has available to it itself to move forward on any of these end uses. Certain end uses like hydrogen trucking or rail may require regional networks of fueling stations to be effective, which Connecticut has limited control over, which may create a rationale for Connecticut to focus state policy on things that it can more directly control, like fuel cells at critical facilities or for power generation. So just some thoughts and examples to provide some context on the broad kind of world of considerations that we're operating in and where this framework fits into it.
And Colin, if you wouldn't mind me just chiming in here a little bit, I think Colin has done a really nice job laying out some of these technical considerations from an end use and a kind of a sources frame. I think the other thing I would flag for folks is we are definitely planning to consider stakeholder feedback and preferences as part of this kind of final recommendations and results. This is we are very interested. We are committed to making sure that we're developing a set of recommendations and solutions that work for Connecticut stakeholders and the kind of particular interests and preferences that folks have. So, it was flagged in one of our discussions yesterday that there's a lot of academic research that's been going into this. And part of this work group process is, again, to collect a little bit more of the on-the-ground feel about how folks are reacting to some of this academic research and whether this aligns with everyone's lived experience and sort of preferences on how the state takes its policy on this front. So just wanted to chime in on that one as a important caveat. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, Aaron. So jumping forward, I wanted to discuss a little bit more exactly how this evaluation framework is being proposed to be used to develop scenarios within the demand analysis that's ongoing as part of this effort. So hydrogen demand from all end uses that are deemed to be cost competitive through this framework, the demand from those end uses will be evaluated as part of this effort. Now, the end uses through this evaluated through this framework can then be separated into what we're calling like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 applications, largely divided in such a way that there's a relatively even division across the different end uses that kind of make it past the first gating criteria. And you can use this tiered system to develop low, medium, and high demand scenarios, as can be seen through the representative division on the right. End uses that score the highest, the demand from those end uses would represent a sort of low use case where you're only using hydrogen in the end uses that are deemed to be the highest value uses of that fuel. The mid use case would be one in which you might include tier 2 applications, which are still very good applications of hydrogen, but just not in not ranked as highly on this particular criteria. Then finally, the high use case could include all applications in which hydrogen has a cost advantage, or at least the potential to be used cost effectively. All of these scenarios will be evaluated based on the demand that each one encompasses, and then compared against analysis regarding the ability to actually produce H2 locally. And so those are the two different sides of the question. What is the potential supply for hydrogen at reasonable price points? And then what is the demand for hydrogen on the demand side? And by comparing those two, you can identify, okay, we have enough hydrogen conceivably to cover the low use case. We have enough hydrogen conceivably to cover the low mid use case. Perhaps we have enough hydrogen to cover the high use case, but this will just let us kind of create a structured way of identifying, based on the expected supply of hydrogen, which end uses could and should we use that hydrogen for. This is just one potential arrangement, though. There are other possible scenario development approaches, perhaps based on specific criteria within the framework, how different end uses rank on very specific end uses that are deemed to be or specific criteria that are deemed to be of primary importance. So I'll keep going through. We have time for questions at the end, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to discuss. But in the interest of time, I'll continue going through the slides through to the end of the initial updated evaluations that we have. First, I wanted to bring us back to these criteria ranking descriptions. I won't go through each of these in detail. You've seen a version of this slide before, but it just lays out sort of how each end use was evaluated on each criteria, what qualifies, a 1, a 2, or a 3, with 3 consistently being the highest rank and 1 consistently being the lowest rank. I'll get into more detail about how we approached each of these evaluations in the next slide, but here I wanted to primarily emphasize that although these rankings can provide insight into the direction, or are meant to evaluate the direction of an impact, they don't necessarily evaluate the magnitude of the impact. For example, the environmental justice criteria is basically structured around, like, does a hydrogen used in a particular application increase or decrease local pollution and impact on frontline communities? It doesn't look at to what degree it increases or decreases that pollution. Similarly, workforce development is focused on, does it increase or decrease the workforce need period, not to what extent does it change that dimension. And so additional analysis might be required to understand exactly what the magnitude of the impact is on any of these fronts. Now, before going into the rankings, I also wanted to provide a bit more insight into how we approached each of these criteria, what kind of questions we asked to arrive at the conclusions that we did, to give a bit more insight into the underlying thought process here. For cost competitiveness, these questions included things like, are hydrogen-based technologies likely to be cost competitive with the most likely decarbonization alternative on a total cost of ownership basis? Do forecasts for technology adoption indicate that hydrogen technologies will take a significant percentage of market share in this sector? And do these forecasts anticipate that the market share for hydrogen technologies is growing faster than alternatives, in which case they would be determined to be would be expected to be the dominant technology over the long term. In addition, do systems level decarbonization studies allocate hydrogen to this particular application when looking at when taking a comprehensive view of where to most cost effectively allocate different fuels across the economy? Where does hydrogen kind of land? For greenhouse gas emissions, we looked specifically at end uses for which hydrogen was deemed to be cost competitive. So excluding any end uses that scored a 1 in the first criteria. And we took those and determined what percentage of Connecticut's hydrogen emissions they were expected to contribute over the long term. So looking specifically at contributions in 2040, the target date for Connecticut's clean energy goals or clean energy target. For commercial readiness, we looked at things like, are there commercial or pilot deployments of this technology in either in Connecticut or elsewhere? Additionally, does this technology require any specific tests with local infrastructure that might delay its deployment in Connecticut specifically? Finally, when do industry players expect this technology to be commercially ready? For infrastructure requirements, we looked at whether this technology requires supporting network infrastructure, looking at like the development of greenfield projects, new pipelines, new fueling stations that don't currently exist. Does this network need to cover the entire state, or can it be focused on specific locations or specific kind of point-to-point coverage? And can this application for hydrogen reuse existing infrastructure or equipment could help it score highly on this particular criteria or higher? Looking at the environmental justice criteria, the major questions are, does hydrogen use increase or decrease levels of local pollutants compared to the current option? In addition, does pollution from this end use substantially impact disadvantaged or frontline communities? So looking at that geographic element, not just is there pollution being produced, but where is it being produced? Finally, is it reasonable to assume that if hydrogen is used in this particular application, that there will be pollution control technologies available to mitigate the impact of hydrogen use on local pollutants? For workforce development, we took a relatively high-level look at this category because it's also being investigated as part of the policy and workforce development working group. We really just focused on, does using hydrogen in this application require additional processes or industries to be developed that might increase local workforce needs? For resilience, again, this is not looking at does hydrogen improve resilience in a particular end use, but really, what is the value of resilience for that end use? And so we looked at things like, does this end use serve a purely commercial function that could be shut off without impacting the broader society? Also looking at from a societal standpoint, how important is it that this end use, this application, remain available through inclement events? Finally, for safety regulation, this is focused on whether or not hydrogen would require a similar level of operational safety procedures to be deployed effectively. Not necessarily would it require new procedures, but compared to the current option, is the level of safety requirements roughly in line with what's currently required. And so questions we asked are, like, does this use of hydrogen require the storage of flammable material in tanks? And so it would require kind of setback standards in terms of where those tanks can be located and how to operate around them. In addition, would the combustion of hydrogen, if required in this end use, need similar safety procedures to what currently exists? So that's a broad overview of kind of how we approach each of these criteria, which hopefully will provide some context to interpret the results that we landed on. Again, there will be time to ask directed questions on this approach near the end of the first part of the presentation. So I'm going to keep moving through, but just be aware that if you have any questions, there will be plenty of time at the end to address them. Now, before going into the sort of updated evaluation, I wanted to first just talk through the next steps in this end use evaluation so that everyone will be aware of kind of where we're going from here. So first, emphasizing that the rankings are updated, not finalized. Participants have had the opportunity to provide feedback over the last week by email, but this meeting itself is designed to be an opportunity for feedback, as Aaron mentioned. And so please take that opportunity to ask questions or provide feedback on how different end uses were evaluated. We're excited to hear your perspective and get a discussion going. In addition, participants who have already provided feedback are welcome to provide more details on the reasoning behind their feedback here. To aid that, we've marked in the subsequent slides any area in which stakeholder feedback suggested a ranking be higher or lower than it is currently indicated at. This isn't saying that, if a ranking was changed because of stakeholder feedback, it was marked. What this means is if a stakeholder had in the past suggested that a ranking be ranked differently than the number that you'll see on the slides, that we noted that preference, so that people would be aware that the ranking on that in the updated evaluation, there were other opinions on how that particular ranking should have been established. So in addition, participants are welcome to provide additional feedback over the course of this week after they've had time to reflect on the rankings and review the slides. We also highly suggest that anyone providing feedback by email or feedback in general also send in studies or other resources that can support those suggested revisions so that we can more easily move forward with them. Now, after this week, we're endeavoring to have the evaluations be relatively finalized so that we can shift to assessing demand from those particular end uses. There is, it will not necessarily be set in stone on Friday. As was noted, the use of these end uses or this ranking will primarily used to identify which tiers different end uses fall into as part of the demand analysis, but because demand from all relevant end uses is being included in the analysis anyway, there may be opportunities to, or not opportunities, but maybe situations in which the rankings shift over time, especially as we engage with more industry participants as part of our analysis of demand. If through interviews with people in the field, we understand that the literature review did not capture every single component of a particular criteria, we can still and would reevaluate at that time. However, we're expecting that those reevaluations past this week would be relatively limited, and we provide very explicit rationales for any changes that take place past this week. And so that's sort of the look ahead. With that additional context, I'll start walking through our evaluation, starting with the applications that we identified as first tier applications. Again, these distinctions are somewhat arbitrary, basically designed to evenly separate the different end uses based on the final rankings, based on the higher scoring, middle scoring, and lower scoring applications. I'll walk through each of these tiers quickly, and then at the end, we'll have opportunity for discussion. If you see any rankings that you would have specific questions on or like more detail on. We'll have time. Please take a note of that now, and we'll go back to it in the discussion period. But quickly walking through this set of applications, we have critical facilities, which are defined as facilities that require 24-hour power backup on site, such as hospitals or data centers. Heavy-duty trucks, with the understanding that, or the assumption that there would be higher hydrogen use in trucks used for long-haul applications that are traveling over 400 miles a day. Aviation, and use in the power sector, either in fuel cells or in turbines designed to combust hydrogen specifically. You'll see a lot of these applications here are, high uses of energy and thereby, emit significant levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And so, high demand, high impact end uses, with this exception of critical facilities, which is an application that is just based on the requirements and kind of use case, was deemed to be a very competitive application for hydrogen as a whole. Moving on to what we're calling tier 2 applications. Again, many of these are also still very good uses of hydrogen, but perhaps they aren't as large a contributor to overall greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Connecticut, and so weren't evaluated as being in the top tier. We have here things like material handling equipment, specialty vehicle fleets, or which are kind of defined as vehicle fleets that have usage profiles that are particularly fitting for hydrogen, long uptimes and localized refueling infrastructure, things like ambulances or police cruisers, which we're still investigating in more detail. And so more information about those will be provided in the future. Transoceanic shipping being a major application of hydrogen, as well as harborcraft, things like ferries, moving people and goods throughout Connecticut and other states. And then finally, buses, again, with the understanding that buses traveling inter-city routes that have long range needs would be the most applicable uses for hydrogen. Finally, looking at tier 3 applications, again, applications that could be considered good use for hydrogen, but are not did not make it into the first or second tier. Things like rail, industrial heat, specifically looking at high heat processes that are difficult to electrify, and then hydrogen blending for non-core customers. So specifically blending hydrogen in with natural gas or biogas to feed to power generation stations or industrial customers, but not residential or commercial customers. Now, the list of end uses that were not included because they were not deemed to be cost competitive compared to the most likely decarbonization alternatives are listed on the far right. This includes passenger cars, 100% hydrogen heat for residential and commercial customers, hydrogen blending for non-core customers, specifically residential and commercial customers, and then finally, low heat industrial processes. So that's a quick look at the initial evaluation. Again, as you can see from the a note in the top left of this slide, these are still preliminary, and we're excited to get your feedback now on the results and the steps we can take moving forward. I've listed a couple of discussion questions here that were kind of touched on throughout the presentation, specifically looking at the rankings. Are there any that you think should be revisited or that you'd like to have explained in more detail? In addition, are there any questions on the approach we took to evaluating specific criteria? Or more broadly, do you have any suggestions on how to use this evaluation to develop demand scenarios or that process specifically? So we're now moving into the discussion phase of the agenda. I see we have a hand raised. So I'll start out with comments from Ben. If anyone would like me to move back to a slide previously on the presentation to either look at it more more closely, or just feed into your comments.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, this is Ben Butterworth from Acadia Center. So I guess, Colin, I didn't mention this to you in my email, but now as I spend a little more time thinking through it, I guess one of my primary concerns here is about there's no weighting with these scoring criteria, and especially in the cost scoring, right? So it accounts for, 2 or 3 or 1 point out of the points total, but I just don't know if that's appropriate if we're using the overall scoring to break these into tiers of which end uses should be prioritized first, which was my kind of understanding of your presentation under low, medium, and kind of high end use scenarios. So there's a lot going into that cost score, right? It's a pretty loaded 1 to 3 scoring, right? It's cost competitiveness on an ownership basis. Is there a significant market share expected for these H2 end uses? Is the market share growing faster than alternatives? Do system level decarbonization studies support the use of hydrogen in this particular end use, right? So it's a pretty loaded one. And for that reason, it seems to me like the cost should be given a larger weighting than some of the other criteria. So like if you take, for example, like look at heavy duty trucks, you have a total score of 19. So it does pretty well in the total score kind of metric, but it's only 2 on cost, right? And so it's put into tier 1, but it's put into tier 1 at the expense of some of the end uses that are in tier 2 that are scoring a 3 on the cost scoring. And the cost criteria is really the only criteria here that compares it against the hydrogen end use against competing technologies, which are primarily electrification, right? So a lot of the other criteria, they're scoring it on a scale of 1 to 3 against like the current status quo, essentially, which in a lot of cases is combustion of fossil fuels. But the cost criteria is the only one kind of scoring it against the most likely alternative technology. So that's just another reason why I think the weighting is appropriate, right? Like battery electric heavy duty trucking would also score well on a lot of those criteria, but it's not displayed in the results, right? Like from a GHG perspective, from maturity, from an infrastructure, from EJ, right? BEVs, they check a lot of those same boxes that hydrogen trucks check. So right, it's a priority sector to decarbonize heavy duty trucking, but a lot of the high score associated with heavy duty trucking, you would also get that same kind of scoring, high score output if you were looking at BEVs. So anyway, I think that's my main concern with how the scoring is taking place, especially when you're putting some of the end uses that are scoring a 2 on cost competitiveness ahead of those that are scoring a 3 and are falling into tier 2, if we're thinking about how to prioritize a limited resource in Connecticut.
That's Aaron, did you want to speak up there?
Yeah, can I chime in here? I guess so Ben, I think what I'm hearing you say, like very loud and clear, is not all of these categories are equal in importance. And I'm concerned that this approach and the lack of weighting is downplaying the relevance of some categories, and we really need to be thinking about how that gets incorporated into the framework so that these numbers are pointing us in the right direction and helping to establish the right priority rankings.
Yes, and particularly the cost criteria, because that's the criteria that's really focused on how does hydrogen end use in this sector compare to the electrified alternative, right? And it's scoring based on the results of that question specifically, whereas a lot of the other criteria, they aren't looking at that comparison. They're saying, does this reduce air quality relative to current air quality levels in this sector? Not does it reduce air quality relative to the equivalent electric technology in 2040. You know what I'm saying? So that's one of the reasons I think it's kind of critical to give the costs rating more weight.
Okay. So even the comparison framework. Sorry, Colin, go ahead.
So I would like to quickly respond. I know we have a couple of other areas of feedback. I just want to throw out one possible answer to Ben's note about weighting. So we ultimately decided not to weight these criteria. because we wanted to stick to a simplified framework. The closest thing that we had to a weighting was the gating criteria for the cost competitiveness criteria specifically. However, something like a weighting criteria could be achieved through the way that we evaluate or to create demand scenarios from these criteria, from these rankings. So right now they're just like, you know, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 is based completely on the final ranking. But as I noted earlier, there's opportunities potentially to create demand scenarios or to factor in specific rankings on individual criteria into those scenarios. But what an example of that could be creating a scenario, something like a limited hydrogen demand scenario or a low use demand scenario for hydrogen, where all the applications evaluated in that scenario are those that score a 3 on the cost competitiveness framework. Therefore, the low demand scenario is specifically focused on, you know, looking at demand from applications that can't really use anything else or determined not to be able to use anything else cost competitively. And then the mid and high use case scenarios would be looking at, okay, if you have enough hydrogen to cover the, you know, scenarios or the applications that actually need hydrogen, you know, what are the other end uses that it could be applied to?
So
I'm just
Colin,
gonna throw that out there.
yeah, I was gonna say, I think there's a bunch of different ways that we can incorporate and like respond to feedback, but I'm expecting we've got 3 hands raised in the chat, and I'm expecting we're gonna get a whole bunch of different feedback from folks. So I think maybe it would be helpful. No, Ben, I want to make sure that like you feel like we're responsive to your comment and we're getting you some thoughts on how we can incorporate this feedback. But I also do want to make sure that we're hearing from a diverse set of folks and the folks who've got some thoughts to share before we get to solutioning or proposing how we might move forward on this. Are folks okay with that from a process standpoint? Okay. I think Tony had put his hand up next, and then Kathy had also raised her hand after that.
Yeah, just a couple questions, and maybe there's some background material that you could send out. In the critical facilities, obviously that's a power generation application. So what was the power conversion technology that you were thinking about? And I was surprised to see aviation get such a good cost score, because that's generally considered a pretty hard application for hydrogen. So I was curious what the aviation application was. And a more general question is, what cost of hydrogen is assumed for all these applications?
Yeah, absolutely. So answering those questions quickly, there is a supporting document that I'll be sure to send you, Tony, that gets into more detail about a lot of these things. But for critical facilities, the generation technology is assumed to be fuel cells. For aviation, the reason why hydrogen scored highly is because we weren't just considering direct use of hydrogen in planes, but also the use of hydrogen to create sustainable aviation fuels that would then be used as a drop-in fuel for longer flights. And for the price of hydrogen that was used, you know, because we're still assessing that as part of the sources working group, we didn't like set a price for hydrogen. This is based on a literature review of you know, studies that other people have done with their own assumptions around where and when hydrogen be competitive. And so you'll see that a lot of end uses where the use case really depends on the cost of hydrogen, you know, they would fall kind of into the 2 category where there's uncertainty or ongoing competition with other potential alternatives that, you know, will ultimately be decided by, you know, which underlying fuel costs are the lowest in the long term. Moving on to Kathy, I see your hand as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, comment on these rankings, and I think the complexity of trying to rank them or weight them, given that I mean, I think at best right now, a lot of these things are going to be used as more of a qualitative comparison than necessarily quantitative. It's to kind of see what rises to the top. And I would caution against using it for too much more than that, just because things are so much in flux right now. I mean, if we go back to the heavy duty truck example, the cost of heavy duty stations is going to come way down in the next 5 years, as is the cost of hydrogen. So to rank it, today at a certain level when it may or may not be there, the ranges of vehicles are different in terms of what fuel they're using. So I think those are all good points. We have to consider them. I just want to also point out that there's a lot of complexities that go into the rankings as they are. And so, I think it's more to look at what's scoring broadly high or broadly low to at least kind of narrow down the scope, maybe.
Thanks, Kathy. That's helpful. Are there any more hands or direct comments?
Yeah, this is Joel. I would, I think I'm going to support my colleagues here that we're trying to take a very complex list of uses and simplify it. And my concern is it may be misused. And when in doubt, I'm going to recommend go back to the statute that establishes task force recommendations for potential uses of hydrogen fueled energy. So it doesn't require, it doesn't ask, it doesn't suggest that we come up with a scoring system that potentially, will be dividing up these uses between, scores of between 15 and 20. So I think we've taken a very complex list of uses and try to oversimplify it. Maybe jumping ahead too fast. My suggestion is ditch the scoring and basically just have a list of uses as the statute requires, establishing this task force, and indicate that they're valid uses. There's some limitations, there's some values, and we can describe them. And I think, as Kathy indicated, provide some language that suggests their use may increase or decrease based on other factors.
Thanks, Joel. I agree. I think that you and Kathy both make really great points about the number of caveats that need to be attached to this kind of evaluation framework. I tried to attach a few myself at the beginning of the presentation, noting that this is a very, these are very complex questions and decisions, and I can't captured by like an 8x12 table on a PowerPoint. And so going forward, we are definitely going to take that into account in terms of how we present it to the legislature, how it's actually applied ultimately. As I noted, applying it to the demand analysis is one approach that we see as being a way to make sure that, end uses are still being considered, but, the relative value of hydrogen can also still play a role through the creation of different scenarios that would inform, how much demand for hydrogen there would be in the region. It's possible we're going to need to put the rankings in the final reports. And just note that they were a ranking system was developed to determine the underlying scenarios. But there's a lot of we were very interested in kind of understanding everyone else's perspective in terms of how to move forward with this very, very complex task.
So I guess I just want to interject here because I think I'm hearing actually some very different points being made by stakeholders. And then Andrea, I see your hand has been raised. But I think the point I'm hearing from Ben originally was generally like the concept of ranking system, like the idea of figuring out priorities. Ben, tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth. But I think that we need to be comparing the relative merits of some of these different ranking criteria to make sure that we're helping to advance good policy. I think I heard Kathy say, it's great that we're getting a snapshot, but things are moving so quickly that, what we have in front of us today, we shouldn't write off anything that could be on the table just because of what we're seeing today. We need to take a more holistic approach. And Joel, I think what you're saying is, actually, this is super, super complicated. And the main thing I'm concerned about is that this scoring and this ranking would exclude opportunities that we think should be considered or included, and we really don't want this, scoring approach to be disadvantaging specific offtake opportunities that we think are still valid. And I want to, because these are all like healthy criticisms of the framework that has been laid out here, but very different healthy criticisms of the framework that has been laid out. So I want to make sure that we're sort of tracking that feedback appropriately. Is there anyone who would amend the way that I've kind of repeated back what I'm hearing?
I think that sounds good to me, and my my add-on would be follow the law.
Okay.
We've got a Connecticut state law, Public Act, that establishes this task force, and it's fairly direct.
Okay, thank you, Joel. Andrea, do you want to chime in here? And then maybe Bernie, I saw you put some language in the chat as well as raised your hand.
Hi, this is Andrea Labowie from Toyota. Thanks everyone for speaking before me. I think those were all really good points. I was also trying to check the notes that I had taken for the meeting last month to make sure this wasn't new. I actually noticed I mentioned this last time, but it's also very hard to put a number on it. And I think statistically, there's a pushback against kind of trying to quantitatively add rankings for specifically the reasons that were brought up before. So thank you guys all for mentioning that. And the thing that I mentioned last month is the one thing it's really hard to give a score to is the difference in practicality and lifestyle of these different technologies. So we talk about is battery EV cheaper or whatever, but it's different. You have to charge it differently. You have to set up your infrastructure differently. You have to fuel in different places. You have to park in different places. You have to have a different home. So I don't know how to put a score on this, and that's why I always push back against these. I understand the purpose because we're all competing for time and bandwidth, but just any conclusion that we'd come to is highly suspect because I'm not sure how to incorporate the practicality. So not only, for instance, battery EV versus hydrogen fuel cell for transportation, that's everyone's favorite, right? The trucks are a different weight. They have different duty cycles. They have different fueling and they have different infrastructure needs. And with light duty vehicles as well. So it's really, really hard to give a number to that because it doesn't just boil down to total cost of ownership.
I see Bernie. First of all, thank you, Andrea, for sharing that feedback as well. In respect for other people's time, while keeping with the hand, I see Bernie is next.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be brief. I pretty much was inspired by, as Andrea was, by some of the prior comments. I think you could take any one of these applications and envision a number of possible scenarios. So beneath aviation, you could have direct fired engine turbines running on hydrogen. You could have them running on hydrogen to liquid fuel. There might be a carrier chemical. I don't know, for example, if ammonia is in that thought process, but every one of these is really could be several different technologies. And just to maybe underscore what Andrea said, until we knew which of those technologies was being contemplated here, it's hard to do a side by side. So I would agree with Joel that maybe we just lay out what we think the big guys are, and as the amount of hydrogen that's available and the associated cost becomes more visible, maybe some of these things would be easier to grapple with at that point. So I'll be quiet down.
Thanks,
Bernie. Ben, your hand up next.
Yeah, so I'd just like to say that I think it's critical that we come out of this process with a scoring matrix. I don't think this scoring matrix is perfect, and I suggested some potential improvements to it. But to just say, all these issues are complicated and things may change, so we don't have any kind of concrete recommendations about which end uses to prioritize in Connecticut as we make decisions over the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think that's an adequate outcome from this process. And responding to the point about battery electric vehicles versus hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and passenger vehicles in particular, there's a number of studies that look at the all-in kind of system level cost comparing those two technologies. Yes, it's complicated to do. You have to look at maintenance cycles. You have to look at charging infrastructure costs. You have to look at hydrogen fueling costs, et cetera, et cetera. But there are a lot of robust studies that have looked at this. And the primary conclusion from those studies is that battery electric vehicle passenger cars are more cost competitive than hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle cars. So I think we have to take the evidence and the data that is there from reputable studies and integrate it into the recommendations coming out of this work group. And the other thing I was going to say, Colin, is if we have a few extra minutes, I'd just be curious to hear you kind of walk through the industrial high heat processes scoring. I'm just kind of overall surprised how low that one came out, and it might highlight some potential areas of improvement for the overall scoring matrix. In my view, that's a pretty high priority for the uses of hydrogen, particularly when you're talking about high heat processes and industrial facilities. And I see a lot of twos, almost all twos there, and a one. And to me, that just kind of raises some potential concerns about how we're evaluating these end uses on the scoring matrix.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
happy.
But Colin, before we dive in there, I was going to say, I think I'm hearing from folks, I'm hearing some like existential questions about the existence of the scoring matrix and its value, and some differences of opinions on that front. And so I just wanted to provide maybe like a lens by which folks could think about the value of a scoring matrix, or at the very least, some prioritization approaches. And I think, when I think about this, for example, I think, hey, one of our recommendations may be we really need state policymakers to dig into these areas more. We've been running a really fast stakeholder process here to get opinions, exactly like what we're getting today, to solicit feedback, but this certainly does not replace the processes that would normally go into a rulemaking. So if we're going to say, hey, we want policymakers to dig in on some of these topics, and our policymakers come back and say, that's great, we have a lot on your plate, pick your top 3 topics that you want us to investigate, right? What would we say those top 3 topics are? What is it that we would want somebody to dig into further? So not that we're trying to say these are good end uses, these are bad end uses, these are medium end uses. I don't think we're at the point where we've got enough of a full record about stakeholder interests, literature, et cetera, to be unilaterally saying do or don't strike this off the list forever, so much as to say, hey, these are some areas that we think have a lot of promise, are really have the potential to achieve many of the outcomes that Connecticut has identified in terms of advancing clean energy, supporting workforce development, supporting equity and environmental justice, right? We think that these are some end uses that really merit some additional work, right? So if we bring that, and we'd like you to sort of spend some additional time thinking about it. So if we bring that lens to the question of what are our priorities here, I think it puts us in a very different position than if we were to say, don't look at these end uses, don't support these end uses, don't enable these end uses, right? Which is not what we're attempting to do here. So I just want to give that to folks as a lens to be thinking about this prioritization matrix. And then kind of, so Shannon, I know you've got a hand raised and haven't had a chance to chime in yet, but wanted to get a reaction from folks. Shannon, if you want to chime in on this, is great, of whether this is a more helpful lens by which to think about the use and the purpose of a prioritization framework. And if this is helping folks to get more comfortable with this concept, or if folks are still feeling pretty concerned about what we're laying out here at the highest level. So Shannon, since you've been so diligent in raising your hand, I don't know if you want to go first, or if other folks who've been chiming in on this matrix want to weigh in on this question.
Sure, I can chime in briefly. I do think that's a helpful lens. I also wanted to voice support for the comments that Ben made a few minutes ago. And then I also wanted to add that in response to the concerns about the technology advancing rapidly, funding, et cetera, I don't think that any of the recommendations in this report need to be set in stone. I think there can be an explicit acknowledgement of the evolving state of play around hydrogen, and perhaps a recommendation that the state revisit this, at some regular intervals to ensure that we're taking account of the evolving situation. So I think that should probably be made explicit, and I think that might address some of the concerns that we're not saying Connecticut needs to follow these recommendations, for years to come, but that they can be revisited as needed.
Thanks, Shannon. That's really helpful perspective. And Tony, I saw you raised your hand after I made this point, so I don't know if you want to chime in.
A couple of things. I tend to also lean toward the qualitative versus quantitative, just because, for example, if you haven't made a common assumption about the cost of hydrogen across these applications, it's hard to say that you really nailed it. But what I really have is a question, which is, when we ask about the value of each application, is this a Connecticut specific question? And I should know this, being on this task force. But for example, I think of aviation as maybe being a smaller sector in Connecticut than versus New York or New Jersey.
They are Connecticut specific, Tony, and the assumptions around, for example, greenhouse gas emissions in the state, which are one of the main kind of specific criteria, are based on expected growth out to 2040, and compared against other types of industries. And so
that makes sense. So your greenhouse gas avoidance were based around Connecticut assumptions.
Correct.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, and Tony, I just want to be clear. I think what you're saying is, I'm okay with prioritization and a framework. I'm worried about false precision, and I'm worried that a quantitative approach may imply false precision, and that we'd be like, well, this is exactly 1 unit better of an offtake, and so there. Okay, that's really helpful.
As an engineer, I love to quantify, but
okay, but it's important to know when there are things that can't fully be quantified, and that we need to be acknowledging the limits of how precise we can get. Okay, that's really helpful.
That's a great summary, you two.
Okay, Andrea, I was just going to ask you to chime in. It sounds like you're also on the concerned about false precision, but okay with a general framework kind of party.
Yeah, I haven't really had the time to deeply digest this. I know I expressed my concerns last month when we were talking about this process, and it's like Kathy was saying, that the costs are changing a lot, and I see the value of returning to things later, but we also need to understand that policy drives action. So if we say, well, we don't really see the cost coming down, and you don't invest in it, you're promising that the costs aren't going to come down.
Right.
So I'd just like to go back to saying that this isn't just about cost. Probably said this last month. I live in a condo and I park in a parking garage. It doesn't matter how much cheaper battery EV is for me. I have no place to charge it, and I won't have any place to charge it. So I can either get an alternative option, or you can accept that I won't be decarbonized. A sector of society, and I'm not alone. I'm firmly middle class. Think about all the other people that don't have their own garages and don't have their own access. So my problem, I understand you need to come up with priorities, but I also am still trying to figure out how we can kind of incorporate these things that can't have numbers put on them.
Yeah, that's a really helpful point. I want to circle back to Joel and Kathy, if you're comfortable being put on the spot a little bit, because I know that the two of you had expressed some pretty strong concerns that the complexity of what we're dealing with here really is not well suited to being captured in something like a framework like this, and that you're really concerned that this may not be giving due credence to the way that these technologies and options may unfold.
Well, look, I like the way you characterized the lens, and that is the lens for what we could be doing. And that's the way I've been looking at this. I really don't want to have a study that's, will be used to, discriminate against some technologies that, might play out in the future with some changes. But I want very much to address the requirements, the requests of the law, the state law, the task force law. They're looking for advice on what to do. We may have some terrific end uses, and they just don't need any help. And I'll use one example, and that is the materials handling. That may be the best end use out there. It's ready for prime time. It's being used right now. It's probably the best hydrogen use right now because it works, it's needed, and it's competitive. What would we say to the state of Connecticut? Throw a party for these guys? It works. And I also agree with some of the comments on the BEV versus the fuel cell EV on the light duty vehicle. You're going to have different strokes, different folks. So, as you put it, I'm concerned about the false precision, and I do want to come up with. I want to use that lens that you presented. I want to be able to go to the legislature and say, here are things you can do. And I also want to characterize maybe some of those uses that may not be, as maybe as fabulous, but they're things we could do right now to achieve compliance with the state law and that would be reflection to a potential application for the hydrogen hub out of the infrastructure bill. So the infrastructure bill has made it very clear. U.S. made, workforce development, environmental justice, disadvantaged communities. I'd like to come up with something that serves up all of those, and we just may not see it in some of the very high rated uses. So it's not going to be easy. But I do, at the end of the day, want to have a report that says, hey, Connecticut legislation, thanks for giving us an opportunity. We've got some recommendations for you to turn into a law.
Thanks, Joel. That's really helpful. And I will flag, the uses working group and Colin have been sort of the tip of the spear on thinking through some of these end use applications and starting this conversation. But we have other work groups that are focused on questions like, hey, where is there funding available to support some of these end uses? Hey, where can we be establishing policy? So to your point, Joel, if we find that there are some end uses that are total rock stars and actually nothing needs to get done, and the answer is just throw them a party, that makes our jobs and the legislature's jobs a lot easier, right? But our goal here, again, is to find places where action can make a real difference, and where we say, hey, we think the state needs to be spending some time thinking about this, spending some time, putting some energy towards figuring out how to enable these industries. So this is, again, like a first pass, and I think should be in helping us to get some indicative guidance and direction about where to focus, but definitely part of a broader process. And I think the thing that I'm hearing from folks very loud and clear is we're really concerned that the numerical rankings that we see here will be taken to be the end all be all, and that's the last time we get a chance to have a conversation about this, and then it's over. And I think, first of all, that feedback is coming in loud and clear, and so we're going to be working really diligently to make sure that does not happen. But I'm also hearing, and this is the piece that we haven't had a chance to get to yet because we're kind of critically interrogating the structure, is there's also some specific pieces and points where we have questions or want to have discussion on the relative rankings of different end uses and how they're scoring and what that means about the opportunities as well. Okay. Does anyone have perspectives, concerns, feedback that we have not kind of repeated back to you at this point? Bernie, I think your hand is still raised from before, so I'm going to go to Andrea, but please chime in if you have some points you'd like to make.
Joel, I think you raise a really good point about putting in perspective what this criteria or this ranking is going to accomplish. Because if it was just a matter of how much money do we spend on which application, we would have lots of opinions on what the end of the rankings show up on. But Joel has an excellent point, is that some applications need policy intervention to ease the way and some don't. And where they fall on this criteria ranking is not encompassed by that. That's going to be a different thing that we need to consider. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Joel.
Okay. All right, so what you're telling me is we're going to have a lot of homework for the policy working group coming out.
Congratulations.
Okay, Joel, I see your thumbs up. Okay, so if no one has any other points that they just want to make sure that we're hearing, Colin, I know that I have absolutely totally blown up your planned agenda for today, and I'm really sorry, but I'm really glad that we got some clarity with stakeholders on this topic. Maybe turning it back to you / the group writ large about how we want to spend our last 15 minutes together, given the initial agenda that you had put together and what you think might be most valuable use of folks' time, given material and where we are in the conversation.
Yeah, I am happy to continue going through the agenda. I'm also happy to stay on this particular topic if people want to revisit other slides or other, have other feedback I'd like to provide. I know, Ben, you asked for a walkthrough of the industrial high process heat evaluation. I'd suggest that unless, there's a number of other people who are interested in seeing that, we connect offline to walk through that. But if there are any other broader or overarching questions we want to address now, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, Colin, we can connect offline just for the benefit of the group. The scores in industrial heat that are kind of flags to me are cost, infrastructure, and resilience. Those are the ones I'm struggling with the scoring, but I haven't looked at it in depth, but we can connect offline.
Okay. Colin, would you mind going back to the agenda just so folks know what their menu of options is in terms of where we can talk about? The other thing is, I know folks have flagged a number of kind of questions and items of feedback for Colin, and we've been having a lot of one-on-one discussions to surface those. And I think something that's starting to become clear is that people have good feedback, but it's very different feedback. And so I think the other thing that I want to throw out there is, Colin and I can plan to circle up after this and think about how we're continuing to create visibility across the stakeholder group about some of the different opinions that are coming up. Because at the end of the day, it is most important that the stakeholders in Connecticut are in alignment about their concerns and priorities, unless that Stratogen knows their concerns and priorities. So I just want to make sure that we're empowering this group to be having these conversations and to be engaging with each other about some of these concerns, priorities, what have you. So just want to kind of flag that as something else that's coming out for me in this conversation. Okay. Well, Colin, we did allocate a good amount of time for Q&A and discussion of end-use evaluation, so maybe I haven't blown up your agenda as badly as I thought.
No, that's not. As long as there's not a ton of questions on. So I'm sure there would be some questions on the hydrogen price curve analysis, and so we might have limited time to discuss that in a Q&A. But I'm happy to walk through it if people want to have an initial look at kind of how we're approaching that. Alternatively, we could walk through the rankings and see if anyone else has any sorts of suggestions like Ben did in terms of specific end uses, but also keeping in mind, maybe through the discussion about, concern about false precision, it's haggling over 1 or 2 points in a particular ranking would also not be the best use of the group's time. I'm going to suggest sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
I was going to say, it sounds like maybe the best use of time would be a brief walkthrough of the price curve analysis. And maybe what we can ask for folks to do, recognizing there'll be limited time for Q&A, is to drop questions into the chat. And then we can follow up to the group with responses to those questions. And then the other thing I think is getting documentation of some of the stakeholder feedback out to folks, since that's definitely going to be a part of how we are planning to represent the efforts of this work group. Okay, thanks everyone.
Excellent. Sounds good to me. Please feel free to drop any questions in the chat. I know we have my colleague Elias on the call. He was also very involved in much of this analysis and can probably speak to any detailed modeling questions in real time. But the quick introduction, we want to make sure, to Tony's point, that we do look at the potential prices of hydrogen when considering our overall supply and demand analysis. Because hydrogen prices obviously can impact consumption and can also inform state policy in terms of providing a better understanding of what level of subsidies would be required to make a particular end-use cost competitive. So just as a quick refresher for many, or perhaps introduction for some, the primary components of electrolytic hydrogen prices are the cost of the electricity, so how cheaply can you produce power, going from offshore wind power, which tends to be more expensive, to curtailed renewable power, which could theoretically be priced at $0. In addition, the cost of the electrolyzer is very important, those capital costs, which are coming down rapidly as manufacturing for that technology scales up. And then finally, the electrolyzer utilization rate. So an electrolyzer that is getting zero cost electricity from that would have been curtailed otherwise, may have an advantage of having very low cost electricity, but if it's not being utilized particularly often, that will also potentially push up the price of the hydrogen coming out of that system. In addition, there are a number of federal policies currently in place to create incentives both for clean electricity and hydrogen production. Clean electricity can benefit from either a 30% investment tax credit on initial capital costs or a 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour production tax credit. And clean hydrogen can receive a very generous subsidy of $3 per kilogram of hydrogen produced, depending on the qualifications it meets. So using those figures, we've done some initial analysis on the potential prices for hydrogen from different primary feedstocks in Connecticut, which you can see in front of you. This is taking levelized cost of electricity predictions from NREL modeling tools, a review of potential electrolyzer cost curves from 2025 to 2050, which we still expect will be refined over time through stakeholder interviews, but as an initial look, you can see here how the impact of tax credits can significantly reduce the cost of hydrogen in the short term, both in terms of pushing down the cost of levelized electricity out to 2032 when the production tax credit and other tax credits start scaling back, as well as for the levelized cost of hydrogen itself, which for every use case or every potential feedstock shoots up around the 2032 mark when the tax credit disappears. I'll emphasize that the tax credit is available to any facility that is installed before 2032 for 10 years, not available up until 2032. So a electrolyzer installed in 2030 would be able to lock in that price of hydrogen, lock in that tax credit out until 2040. It doesn't go away at 2032. But that's the cutoff point for the installation of projects. This also doesn't include the cost of hydrogen or the cost added by connecting infrastructure such as pipeline or any storage requirements. If you consider like a wholesale price of hydrogen, and so there are a number of other costs that would be added on if we're going to be transported as part of a larger system. Comparing that cost of hydrogen, this cost of hydrogen estimates over time, we see that hydrogen economics are generally strongest in the transportation sector, but the cost of connected infrastructure will play a significant role. So in this, unfortunately, somewhat monochromatic graph, you can kind of see the prices of hydrogen from different feedstocks and 5-year snapshots. And then at the lines represent the cost that hydrogen would need to be cost less than, or at least cost the same as different fossil fuels based on relative energy content between hydrogen and the fossil fuel and the relative efficiency of converting that energy to a useful power based on the underlying technology, whether it be a fuel cell, a combustion turbine, what have you. Now, these fossil fuel prices are taken from the EIA's Energy Outlook, which tends to be relatively conservative. And so we'll definitely be refining these estimates going forward with other sources of data. But here's just kind of an initial look at the price points that hydrogen could potentially hit and would need to hit to be cost advantageous from a fuel standpoint, not necessarily from a capital expenditure standpoint. So I wanted to discuss, before we get into a little bit of time for questions, it seems, the next steps for this analysis. We're expecting to refine these forecasts through conversations with project developers and other industry stakeholders, focusing on things like expected changes to electrolyzer prices, ancillary costs for hydrogen production, including things like balance of plant and water supply, the type of electrolyzer to be used. Currently, we assume that alkaline electrolyzers are used as a default, but that might not be true as the best option for every feedstock. And finally, preferred project structures in terms of length and financing terms. We plan to ultimately incorporate infrastructure costs into these estimates and use this and then finally add on analysis around the hydrogen supply and potential demand from different feedstocks and end uses. So not just saying, what price could hydrogen be produced at from a specific type of renewable energy feedstock, but how much hydrogen could you produce at that price based on existing renewable energy resources. Similarly, not just what demand or what price would hydrogen need to be competitive for a particular end use, but what is the demand for that particular end use. I'll pause here, and we see 3 minutes left for questions. I'll pull up my screen. I can't see if there are any hands up. Looks like we have one from Tony.
Yeah.
And then start with Tony.
Yeah. Hopefully you send this out after, because I really wanted to look at that previous chart for a while. But you had like a price of hydrogen from a turbine power plant. That means the turbine power plant is making electricity from fossil fuel and you're electrolyzing?
No, that means that if hydrogen were used in a fuel cell to produce grid power, what price would the hydrogen need to be in order to be competitive with a gas turbine producing?
Oh, okay.
Power?
That's helpful. And the other question I have is, maybe it's a scoping question and maybe it's a naive question, but you're not considering imported hydro as a power
No, that
source?
wasn't actually a renewable energy resource that was listed in the initial workforce order, and hasn't been something that's come up in our discussions, but it's something that we can definitely take back in our conversations in the sources working group as we continue to understand and decide on which other feedstocks we might consider. Like in general, wind, solar, and offshore wind are just kind of the end uses or feedstocks that we expect will absolutely be considered. There's other potential feedstocks like nuclear energy, like potentially biomass, that could also be considered. And so the number of feedstocks here could be expanded as our work moves forward.
Okay.
So definitely,
All right.
we'll that,
Yeah, that's helpful because there were there were biomass maps in the deck from the previous meeting and so forth. So thank you.
Yep, absolutely, no problem. And Ben, I saw your hand up. Be a chance to, and then Mary, we'll go order in order. Ben.
Yeah, I've got to jump to another call in a minute, but I was just a little confused on slide 20 when it's talking about wind, solar, offshore wind, and curtailed energy. If the wind, solar, and offshore wind, if that's talking about dedicated renewable energy resources that are strictly for the purpose of powering electrolyzers versus kind of curtailing excess renewable energy on the grid. So that distinction, just trying to make that clear.
Thanks for that is an important clarification that I like to mention. Yes, wind, solar, and offshore wind bars all refer to dedicated renewable energy for hydro production. The curtailed energy is an initial estimate pulled from Connecticut, the Connecticut decarbonization IRP's estimate for the regional curtailment rates in 2040 based on their expected energy mixes.
Got it. Thanks.
No problem. And Mary, we've got maybe a bit more time if you want to jump in with your question.
I think you covered it,
comment.
Colin. You just mentioned that there would be other feedstocks considered, including nuclear. I know that was mentioned in the statute, so just wanted to highlight that and encourage nuclear energy to be considered as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Well, in that case, I think we're ending pretty much right on time. Feel free to follow up with any other comments or feedback. As I mentioned, we're still working on revamping or I guess finalizing this evaluation framework, and it seems like we have quite a bit of work to do. So don't be shy about reaching out with additional thoughts. Thank you for your time, and everyone have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate the engagement and feedback today. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.